The security guard looked at me like I had pocket lint where my resume should be. He was the kind of man who'd been trained to see danger in tennis shoes and jeans, a practiced distrust of anyone who didn't smell like a cocktail hour. I had on a thrift store blazer, a comfortable dress so I could move around the kitchen if I needed to, and a pair of shoes that could sprint. To him, I was a guest's plus one who'd wandered off the red carpet. To me, I was someone who owned the building he was guarding. "Main entrance is for wedding guests only," he said, as if those were words carved in stone. "I'm meeting a friend," I tried, voice polite, even amused. Nothing about my tone announced that I'd signed the paperwork the city required, or that my logo hung on the corporate office wall. They teach security to read envelopes. They don't teach them to read balance sheets. "You'll have to use the service entrance," he repeated, a rehearsed cadence that suggested he'd been doing this exact thing for years. Behind him, the glass doors reflected a ballroom full of taffeta and champagne fingernails, bridesmaids arranging their sashes like ritualistic armor. My sister, Madison, somewhere in that glitter, had asked me, texted me, to dress up, which in Madison speak meant a 3-hour hair appointment and a dress purchased at a price that could make my accountant cough. I told her I'd be there. I meant it. I just hadn't accepted the script she wanted me to play. I walked to the service entrance because the guard was right and because I wanted the service entrance. The short version of my life is that I prefer to know how the gears work. The long version is that I built a chain of hotels because I liked fixing things other people were certain couldn't be fixed. Old plumbing, tired staffing models, the terrible coffee in most hotel lobbies. It took years. It took a lot of no's and a lot of late nights rewriting spreadsheets in the glow of someone else's abandoned conference room. 17 properties later, you learn that the best place to overhear real things is where the plates are clattering and the staff are tired and mess to speak honestly. That was the plan for the night, be invisible until the right moment. Madison didn't need to know how I ran my life. She needed to be Madison at her wedding. And I wanted to be there for her without being her props manager. I slipped through the heavy door and into a world defined by steam and urgency. The kitchen is where the fantasy of a wedding becomes tangible. There was garlic first, a warm, biting scent that seemed to follow the servers like a devotional haze. The head chef, Fipe, a tight-lipped man with a tattoo peeking from under his sleeve, was orchestrating a chorus of shouting knives and timers. Plates clattered. Someone yelled, "Wellington in 20," as if the word Wellington could itself settle nerves. Servers moved like school of fish, bodies brushing past each other and practiced choreography. Distant laughter from the ballroom sounded like a radio on low volume, happy, detached. I tied on an apron I'd tucked under an arm and took my station, because that's what people do when they want to be invisible. You move slower, you smile, you carry a tray like you're part of the scenery. People assume that if you're serving, you're not watching. They assume most things. Madison had been a study in contradictions all evening. Earlier, she'd left me a terse message. "Kins, dress nicer. This is important." The subtext, as always, was that the wedding was not just a union, it was positioning. Mrs. Ashford had arrived in an outfit that suggested a family crest, deliberately chosen. Mr. Ashford hovered like a man used to being watched. Chase, the brother, flirtatious in a way that felt like a test at every laugh, kept orbiting the better-lit people. Brett, the groom, fidgeted between loyalty and mortified embarrassment, which I found comforting. He looked like the kind of man who would apologize if he spilled a drink on a stranger. By the time I was 3 trays deep, the staff had started to warm to me. There's an economy of kindness in kitchens. A smile earns a saved step. A steady hand earns the respect that tips cannot buy. I worked with David, the general manager, for a few minutes carrying plates and watching how he read the room. David is the rare person who can manage with a quiet authority. He notices the things nobody else does. When he asked my name, I gave him one I'd used enough times that it fit. Cass. "You knew?" he asked, not an accusation, but an inventory. "Temporary," I answered. Temporarily was accurate. I was there for a night. A job in the ledger called wedding hospitality. He nodded and handed me a tray with a smile that implied 1,000 small favors to come. I knew then, because experience fills in the cracks, which staff would be allies when things got messy. Madison's behavior in the ballroom landed with the sort of clarity that kitchens often offer, measured, precise, unavoidable. The bridesmaids flitted around her like satellites. She barked instructions through a face flushed with the kind of anxiety only someone who believes their wedding is a performance will have. "No, we're not doing that," she told a matron of honor who suggested a rearrangement. Later, I saw her lean over a server, the kind of closeness that's meant to assert dominion, and tell them quite enough for a recording not to catch, but loud enough for me and my apron, that the hors d'oeuvres had better be perfect. The server's jaw tightened, a flicker of restraint. He looked like a man trying to be kind without being owned. The kitchen tells you everything people try to hide. Behind the steam, staff are candid. Philip, who has hands that move with the precision of someone who once wanted to be a pianist, muttered about princesses and people who think a wedding is an entitlement. He told a story about Mrs. Ashford requesting a menu change at the last minute, as if the hotel's culinary team were an accessory to be remade for her pleasure. The staff exchanged glances when Mrs. Ashford's name came up. Their language was professional, but it carried an undercurrent, annoyance that turned into a covert form of loyalty to the workforce. These servers knew how to spot entitlement. Entitlement, after all, is loud, and kitchens have long ears. I slipped away to the back office under the pretense of grabbing more napkins. The private office smelled of lemon cleaner and old contracts. I sat at a leather chair that had imprints from years of other people making small, consequential decisions. It's one thing to own a business. It's another to need your key to open the locked drawer. My key fit, as if the lock had been expecting me. I sat and watched the monitors, because that's where truth rarely hides, in grainy, time-stamped footage. On the screens, the ballroom was a living painting. For a long moment, I watched the fuzzy light of twirling dresses and the glint of a fork hitting a plate. Then I saw what I hadn't expected to see, and what changed the evening from awkward to necessary. In camera 3, one of the groom's uncles, Chase, slid his hand down the back of a vendor's bag. Not a casual gesture, not a helping touch. He slipped something inside as casually as folding a napkin. The vendor's expression did not suggest distress, more like resigned compliance. On camera 2, Mrs. Ashford lingered longer at a table than courtesy demanded, leaning to whisper something that made a guest laugh too brightly, the sort of laugh that masks discomfort. On camera 5, a man whose badge read Vendor Floral Services opened a clutch purse and handed someone, Mrs. Ashford I thought, an envelope. The resolution of security footage is not cinematic, it's bureaucratic, but when you've trained your eyes to look for patterns, bureaucracy can expose motives. I made a few quiet calls. The CFO picked up on the third ring, because she always picks up when I call, and I kept my voice low. I asked for a quick check on an account, something small, confirmation that a check issued to the venue had cleared. There was a pause that said more than any words. Checks don't bounce in my world. I was used to the speed of legitimate payments. I had built a business that depends on that reliability. The CFO, who I'll call Mara because she is one of those brilliant people who prefer shorthand to small talk, sent a single line text. Payment not cleared. Check number 8421 returned, insufficient funds. She included a timestamp and a scanned image of the bounce stamp. I sat in the office, and the sound from the ballroom felt distant until it didn't. The wedding music continued, but the edges were different now. When you know where to look, a bounce check is not just an accounting glitch. It's a line that connects to a house, to a credit history, to the kinds of secrets people bring to parties wrapped in silk. The documents in my inbox opened like doors. 3 properties listed under an Ashford family trust, large mortgages, tax liens from a county 2 states over. None of this was illegal evidence, it was public record. Nothing that would make a prosecutor salivate. But I was not seeking to put anyone in a cell. I was trying to understand why someone who had spent an evening arranging their dignity like a display would hand a vendor an envelope with a worrisome flutter. I scrolled through more footage. There was Chase, pocketing something that couldn't have been an innocuous trinket. There was a quick exchange with a vendor. The vendor's expression told me he knew what he was doing. Not every transaction is criminal. Some are simply transactional in ways that reflect desperation. The footage suggested a plan that was less criminal theater and more practical manipulation. Mrs. Ashford and Chase were moving money in favors in ways designed to keep appearances afloat. If the check bounced and the family was repositioning assets, they weren't rich quietly. They were rich in the way some people are rich, on paper, when it suits them. The term old money has always been a curious thing to me. It's less about the money than it is about a posture. Mrs. Ashford had the posture perfected, but posture can crumble. I'd seen it before. A family that sold appearances as a product and then had to borrow from those images to keep the facade bright. Tonight felt like a tightrope walk where the net was made of unpaid bills. I didn't immediately call the Ashfords. I called people I trusted in the building. David, the general manager, listened without surprise and then nodded into his headset. He showed up in the office as if he had been summoned, a man who moves in low gear until a problem needs his particular kind of quiet competence. "You okay?" he asked, not prying, but giving me the space to tell him what I'd found. "I think someone tried to buy an image tonight," I said, "and whatever they bought, the invoice didn't clear." David didn't smile. "That could get messy," he said. He used the word as if it were an inventory item. He also knew me well enough to know when I wasn't asking for a managerial report. "Can you hold on to those camera files?" he asked. "Legal should look at them. And security, can you loop them in?" I texted the head of security, who responded with a thumbs up. We aren't, by any stretch, a vigilante team. There was no desire here for petty revenge. There was a need to be prepared. The law has its pace. My advantage is that I own the place. I can ask for an expedited review. I can hold footage. I can ensure that when the ballroom lights go down, the story told is truthful and not a rumor stitched by gossip. As I prepared to step back into the kitchen, Phipe pulled me aside. He had that look of someone who both loves and resents the world that feeds him by the grace of patrons that never see him. He was a man who believed in good food and bad fairy tales. "You be careful with family," he said, more warning than instruction. "I'll be careful with truth," I said. He grinned a short, wry grin. Same difference sometimes. Back in the kitchen, the service was a study in controlled chaos. Servers floated like practice dancers, and I moved among them collecting a tapestry of small truths. Chase laughed a little too loudly, the sound carrying down into the pass where Phipe lives. Mrs. Ashford made an appearance, a small curated walk through the kitchen, as if she were inspecting a boutique. She stopped by the pass and gave a look that was half approval, half evaluation. It's amazing what people think they can evaluate without touching. Service, taste, the very soul of a room. She assumed, probably, that we existed to be judged. There's an intimacy to working during a wedding that visitors don't get. When you carry a tray, you encounter hands that have stories. A grandmother's fragile fingers that curl when you bring soup. A best man whose handshake is a compressed apology. The staff absorb all of these micro-narratives, and if they're decent humans, they respond. Tonight the staff responded with professionalism, but there was an undercurrent that something more unsavory was beating at the margin. I found a moment to slip away again. The monitors called like a compass. I pulled up the footage with a small click and watched the same scenes, now replayed in the slow justice of surveillance. Chase sliding a debt-bundled note into a vendor's hand, Mrs. Ashford holding a phone at an angle that made her voice hushed but purposeful. There was also the moment that tightened my jaw, an exchange near the gift table where a hand went too long into a purse. The footage didn't scream criminality, it whispered opportunism. Public records told a more legible story. The Ashfords had 3 dotted lines of properties, large mortgages, and a trust that bought a house in a different state the week before. I'm not a banker in the romantic sense. I don't keep ledgers for the drama. I keep them because they tell me where people are choosing to stand. The Ashfords were choosing appearances. It's an understandable choice when your reputation is your currency. It's also a brittle choice. That's when I pulled out an old habit I never stopped having, calling in favors. I texted a few people with short messages that looked unremarkable. David, Mara, security. They responded with quick confirmations and, most importantly, with readiness. Readiness matters. In the quiet of my office, I made a plan that was surgical rather than theatrical.
There would be no ambush, no public shouting. There would be evidence gathered in a way the boardroom would accept. Footage, scanned records, timestamps, and statements. I wanted the truth to stand in the light and not under my lamp. I also wanted Madison to have a chance at something better than humiliation. That was the honest part of my motive. I am not immune to family. My bones hold my sister like anybody else's. I watched her from a monitor as she stood with her father, her composure on the brink like the edge of a knife. Madison's perfectionism is a mask for terrors that are not mine to fix, but they are mine to witness. My goal was not to wreck her life. It was to prevent the kind of damage that comes when people are used as props in a narrative not of their making. I moved back into the kitchen, keeping my face neutral. The staff were already preparing for a storm that had not yet broken. Phipe handed me the small plate with a seared scallop and a parsley garnish, the kind of small mercy chefs give to people they think will understand. I ate it quickly, the briny heat grounding me. I listened to the rhythm of the room, a whistle, the snap of a towel, the soft murmur of servers slipping past each other. The ballroom glowed like a separate planet on the monitors. Later, much later, by my reckoning, Madison's voice broke the rhythm. She called me during a lull, and for a second, the sister I knew was audible through the theater of bridedom. "Kins," she said, tentative. "I'm here," I answered. "How's everything?" "There's some tension with my mother." Her voice had the crack in it people get when they're trying to be brave, but the world is pressing. "She's making all kinds of demands. I don't know why she's doing that now." "People put on shows for reasons you won't understand yet," I said, which was both true and a small truth I wanted to give her. "You doing okay?" "I'm starting to feel like this isn't even my wedding," she said, and there it was. That brittle honesty that made me love her and want to fix things she hadn't asked me to fix. Everyone's looking at me like I have to be perfect. "You don't," I said. "You need to be you. The rest is decor." "Do you have to be at the front?" she asked. "I wanted you to be there." "I'm in the building," I told her. "If I'm not at the front, I'll be somewhere near the pass. I'll be unseen." The line clicked silent after that, the kind of pause that suggested she had something else to do, like arrange the final flower or sit in a chair and breathe. I went back to work, a professional at the business of being small in a room of grandeur. By 10 p.m., the ballroom was a planet of its own making. Glasses clinked, laughter stung the air, and for a moment the Ashfords looked like they had successfully curated the evening of their choosing. The servers moved harder now. The staff had done everything well. The wedding by all external measurement had been a success. But the work behind a wedding is not measured only in success. It's measured in what people choose to hide, to borrow, to risk. I sat in the dim office, cross-checking the footage and the documents. No prop I placed on a table tonight would outshine what a company can do legitimately. That's why ownership matters. Ownership gives you a steadying hand when walls do their best to close in. I picked up the phone and dialed David. "We're going to need to secure the footage," I said. His reply was immediate, the rhythm we keep when something needs to be done right. "I'll have security create a backup and loop legal." "Are you sure you want to escalate?" "I don't want to escalate. I want to preserve facts," I said. "If we present this cleanly, no one can spin it into gossip." When you own something, you have the right and the responsibility to steward it. Stewardship isn't always loving. Sometimes it's administrative. I arranged for a legal team to be on a short line, and David arranged for security to preserve the raw files. Mara confirmed the financials. The map of actions started to look like a chessboard. Pieces moved quietly, coordinated in pockets of competence. I dressed myself again, no longer the temporary server, but still refusing to walk into the ballroom through the front, because there is power in the unexpected. I had a plan that required me to be seen as nothing more than a seam in the evening's fabric, until the exact moment I chose to reveal I'd been holding the seams together. There is a particular hum that happens when you get close to turning a plan into action. The room seems to sharpen. You can hear the clink of glass different. Everyone on my little list, David, Fipe, security, legal, had agreed on a single premise. Truth must be presented in a way that doesn't humiliate for sport. I had no taste for public cruelty. My taste for justice came dressed in civility. I stood in the service corridor and braced myself against the cool tile. I could hear the music through the door, and of course there was the small, delicious thrill that we all get when we know something others do not. I was not going to ambush anyone with trophies of failure. I was going to present facts. I would do it by playing the truth in a room that had already paid to be entertained, and I would do so because the Ashfords' choices tonight extended beyond their dinner budget. They used people like props, and props get hurt when they are dropped. As I slid my apron off and let my shirt breathe, I checked my watch. Timing is everything. I double-checked the folder on the desk that David had left for me. Legal had compiled a small binder with copies of the bounce check, the relevant public records, and still images of the most damning footage. It was a pile of paper that looked and felt like a promise. This is the part of the story where people usually choose sides.
You either like the person who stands up to entitlement, or you feel for them because it's messy to watch a family quarrel play out in public. I was somewhere between both feelings. I love my sister fiercely, but I cannot love the way she was being used by a family who prioritized appearances over her personhood. I took a breath, and the plan that had been simmering all evening started to tint with color. David had arranged for the AV system to be ready. Security had the raw footage. Legal had the checks and the property records ready for projection as public documents. The staff would be supported and compensated for any disruption. And me? I would walk back to the ballroom as if I were a server bringing a tray of flutes, and at the right moment, I would flip the switch. I told myself I was being measured. I told myself there would be no relish in it, only a need to set the record straight. I slipped into the hallway that led back to the ballroom and paused. From where I stood, I could see a sliver of the dancing shoes and felt the music as if through walls. Madison stood by a table, a flower in her hair. She laughed in a way that suggested bravery. Her mother hovered nearby, a silhouette that had spent an entire life making sure the world knew where her family fit on some imaginary map. As I collected myself to step back into the room, an internal voice, calm, practical, slightly amused, reminded me of the very thing that had shaped the life I led. Information is power, but compassion is the test of how you wield it. I had the information. I had a plan that would not destroy, but would reveal. I had a sister who might be humiliated, and yet might be spared by truth presented cleanly. I straightened the tray in my hands, put on the mask of an invisible server, and walked into the light. I stepped through the ballroom door with a tray of champagne flutes and a face trained to be part of the wallpaper. The room swallowed me for a second, crystal light, laughter batting like moths around chandeliers. Then I moved with the rhythm of service, elbows tucked, smile measured, eyes soft. If you're into revenge done right stories, hit subscribe. Not because I want the applause, but because someone once taught me that patience is a public virtue. The plan was simple enough in theory. Be the staff that carries the room's atmosphere when it falters. Then when the moment arrives, hand the microphone to truth. David was on the other end of the headset, his voice small and steady in my ear. Legal had their backs to the wall, but not their pens uncapped. Security sat in the dim control booth like referees at the edge of a fight they hoped wouldn't happen. Fipe had promised me a look when it was time. Mara had texted 3 dots and then a thumbs up from somewhere beyond the spreadsheet horizon. Everything that needed to be ready was ready. All that was left was choreography. I moved down the ballroom aisle, angles rehearsed from years of reading people, until I reached the AV station where David and the tech team looked as if they'd seen the future and were holding it politely for others. He handed me a small remote with an owner's imprint, in the way someone hands over a key. It was enough, and it was symbolic. The hotel's systems recognize an override flagged to corporate. No theatrics required. Ownership was a quiet thing most nights. Tonight it would be a voice. I cleared my throat, the sound swallowed by polite music and the shuffle of dessert. The projector hummed awake like a sleeping thing that likes attention, and the ballroom went quiet because people can't help themselves when a light starts to tell a story. I took the remote in my hand and let it feel heavier than a tray of flutes. I had gone long on preparation, so I could be short on apology. "Excuse me," I said, voice even, practiced for both tenderness and authority. Conversation tapered off the way rings do when tossed into a pool. 100 eyes turned toward the pass where I stood, a pale island of service attire in a sea of silk. "My name is Kinsley Wong," I said, "and I own this hotel." There was the expected audible intake, the sort that sounds like someone trying to recall if they've left an oven on. Mrs. Ashford's painted smile thinned like paper under steam. Chase's laugh died in his throat. People love to pretend they understand hierarchies until the hierarchy announces itself in a sentence that rewires everyone's assumptions. I didn't shout. I didn't need to. David clicked the first file, and the projector fed the room a fuzzy, time-stamped image. Camera 5, 3 minutes after cocktail hour. A vendor, anonymized on the screen with their badge visible, approaches the gift table. The grainy quality of security footage does something strange. It makes guilt less theatrical and more routine. The vendor opens a clutch purse, withdraws an envelope, and hands it across a table where Mrs. Ashford stands. You could see the envelope change hands like a bad habit traded at a party. There was a rustle of conversation. Someone murmured, "Is that?" and then stopped, because the picture kept speaking. I clicked again. Camera 3. Chase reached behind the vendor's coat with a wrist that had the practiced discretion of someone used to fixing appearances with small payments. The hand slid into a pocket. The angle was ugly in the way of small betrayals. I let the images sit in the room. Projection enlarges shame into a size that hospitality can't polish away. No one laughed. No one clapped. The music that had been oblivious stuttered to a stop. "Those are hotel security files," I said. "Raw footage, time-stamped." I felt legal watching me. A contained expectation that I would not overstep. I unfolded the binder David had placed in my hand. A neat stack of scanned documents and a photograph of a check stamped with a return notice. I held the image of the check up so people could read the words projected as a headline. Returned, insufficient funds. The number on the check was clear. The amount was not small. "Madison," I said, because some words are for the person who will feel them first. "This check was issued to the venue tonight." I watched the color leave her face like paint peeling. It did not clear. Her hand flew to her mouth. I had no pleasure in seeing the moment someone realizes the stage under their feet might be a false timber. I had purpose, not malice. My tongue kept the sting softer than the facts deserved. Mrs. Ashford made a move to speak, a habitual clearing of the deck that her voice had done at many tables. "This is preposterous," she said, as if the projection were a theatrical device and not a bank stamp. "There must be a mistake. We paid in cash." "You handed an envelope to a vendor," I said. "We have that on camera. We have a bounced check stamped by the bank." I let the room look at the photographs of property ledgers that legal had pulled. 3 properties listed under a family trust, mortgages, tax liens flagged in county records. They were public files. Anyone could look them up the morning after a rumor. Tonight, the rumor had a binder. Chase tried to laugh. It sounded like someone clearing a throat with cotton. "This is," he began, and his voice peaked and fell into a pit of sudden self-awareness. No one in the room wanted to be the person who sided with a riffle of secrecy against a room full of evidence. Mrs. Ashford's voice sharpened. She attempted an explanation about generosity and community obligations, about appearances and loans arranged in good faith, but the explanations bent under the weight of photographic proof. When someone's actions are captured on camera, handing people envelopes, slipping hands into purses, those actions ask for context that can't be invented on the fly. The vendor, in a small magnified image, looked like someone in 1,000 similar roles, necessary, practiced, and not surprised. You could see his shoulders shrug on the screen the way someone who trades favors for work often does. I invited legal to speak. The lawyer stood with the gravity of someone who prefers documents to drama. "These are public records and hotel security footage," she said. "We are presenting evidence of transactions this establishment processed tonight." She didn't say bribery, she didn't need to.
A room full of guests understood the meaning of financial impropriety when they saw exchange captured and payment returned marked insufficient funds. The law would take its course. The court of reputation was already convened. Mrs. Ashford sputtered, and then with a gesture that was all theatrical control, accused me of humiliating my niece on purpose. "How dare you," she said. "This is my daughter's wedding. You could have done this privately."
The word privately was an attempt at claim staking, privilege claiming even in the face of evidence. People who live by posture clutch at words like lifebuoys. This was the moment I had rehearsed to avoid cruelty. I looked at Madison, who stood with her hands clasped so hard her knuckles went pale. I thought about how often people confuse exposure for cruelty. I wanted truth, yes, but I wanted something else too, for Madison not to wake up tomorrow and find that kindness had been mistaken for weakness. "Madison," I said softly, holding the room's attention like a candle in a blown-out attic, "I'm not here to weaponize shame. I'm here because you deserve the truth without it being dressed as a favor to someone else." I watched her shoulders, the exact way they rose when she was trying not to sink. She found her voice then, shaky and small. The tears were close. "I had no idea," she said, which may have been true, or it may have been a refusal to look. The truth is always messy when it involves the people you love. Brett stepped forward. He was not the type to grandstand. The best of him had always shown in private gestures. He cleared his throat, a detail that a wedding guest would miss, but which I noticed because I noticed subtleties. "Kinsley, I'm sorry," he said, eyes not leaving mine. "You didn't deserve to be treated like that at the door." He looked at Madison then, like someone choosing the honest road over the comfortable one. "We'll fix this together," he said. It was the kind of sentence that demands action, not performance. Chase, on the other hand, tried to laugh it off again, and this time the room turned on him like a collective eyebrow. He lost color. He reached for his phone like a man scavenging for a script. "It wasn't," he began, and Mrs. Ashford made a sound that tried to be dismissive and sounded like a choke. Social currency can be as fragile as a champagne flute in a crowd. I let the footage speak louder than accusation. Camera angles, timestamps, bank stamps, these are the things that strip away plausible deniability. I explained what we had: footage showing transactions, a return check image, property records that suggested the family's assets were more posture than cushion. I said it slowly, without relish. The goal was not to destroy, but to clear the air. I wanted the facts to stand like a clean window between the guests and their assumptions. "You brought me into an environment I did not expect to be hired into," voice high with wounded dignity. "You had no right to." "You have every right to feel hurt," I replied, "but I have every right to protect this property and the people who work here. When I see someone using this evening to patch up a personal financial problem with favors and envelopes, I am obligated to preserve the interests of this hotel and its staff. That's what ownership means." The word landed differently out of my mouth, not a threat, but a statement of duty. Someone in a silk dress sniffed like they were offended on principle. Guests shuffled, newly aware of their own presence in a scene that had been staged for them. The staff, who had worked all night, looked on with the complex emotions of people who have long been given the role of bearing other people's ceremonies. Phipe's jaw was a line of quiet approval. David's hand brushed the back of my arm, and there was gratitude there, tucked into the gesture like a note. I closed the presentation with the simplest fact: we will preserve the footage. We will seek the hotel's remedy for the returned payment. We will ensure that any vendors impacted are reimbursed. It was administrative, and it smelled of office brass and coffee. I made sure the staff knew they would not bear the cost of someone else's accounting tricks tonight. David had my word, and the hotel's ledger, to make good on that. Madison moved as if her knees had been punched. She turned slowly to the room. "I'm sorry," she said, and the sentence was thin but sincere, more than I'd hoped for, less than I'd expected from someone under the spotlight her mother loved. She approached the servers at the pass, and to the staff's evident surprise, she went down on one knee, an awkward, humbling movement that read as genuine. "I'm so sorry. I should have asked. I should have—" Her apology trailed into things that weren't pretty, but they were true. The staff accepted. A couple of them exchanged looks like people who had seen the Ark of Charity and knew what to do with it. A server in the corner, a quiet man named Luis, gave her a brief, measured nod. Phipe, who doesn't do theatrics, pressed a hand to his chest, and then, in a small act of generosity, handed Madison a napkin that wasn't an insult, but a kind of mercy. And then something practical happened, the kind of move that turns performative contrition into durable repair. I spoke to Madison privately, right there by the pass. "This isn't about punishment," I told her. "It's about learning. If you want help, I'll arrange for you to work with our events team, paid, for a set apprenticeship. You'll learn how logistics are run and what responsibility looks like." She nodded, tears making her mascara trail like little inked testimonies. Brett surprised me. After he'd stood in that awkward circle of family and friends and truth, he turned to me without fanfare. "If you're offering a job or a place to learn," he said, "I'll do it. I want to earn my life in honest work." He had the sort of conviction that is more useful than 100 speeches. I offered him a role in operations training, something that involved long hours and honest labor, the sort of thing that builds a person stronger than a string of appearances. Chase glared like a man who'd been caught short and had no tools to repair himself. He left the room with his mother in a swirl of scarves and apologies muttered like currency. Miss
Ashford lingered, eyes unreadable, and then departed without a word, an absence that felt like an indictment louder than any speech could be. They didn't get dragged out, but they didn't leave with their usual entourage. People notice when a narrative collapses, and no amount of perfume can hide the smell of a story unraveling. After the reveal, we did what owners who want repair do. We cared for the people who had been on the margins of the spectacle. David handed the servers envelopes with bonuses in them, and the words "for tonight" printed on the memo line. We reimbursed vendors who had been shorted. Mara, ever the practical, arranged for the hotel to donate the surplus centerpieces and platters to a local shelter. Phipe insisted on a staff meal on the house, and the kitchen, so often invisible, sat down together and ate like civilians after battle, quiet, relieved, thankful. Madison apologized to the staff. It was clumsy and sincere. Apologies rarely match the dignity of what they attempt to repair. She promised to learn, not just as a way to avoid future embarrassment, but as a way to stand for herself. I watched her trade a sequence of small, earnest sentences with people who had, until that night, been her underlayer of service. To them, apology is weighted differently than it is to a room of guests. It's earned by steady action. The Ashfords departed with the kind of contrived composure people practice for generations. The social scaffolding that had propped their persona had its timbers weakened by records and timestamps. I won't pretend that a binder and a projector demolish the scaffolding of a life overnight, but reputations and credit lines often move together. Once a public posture is shown to be more costume than fabric, creditors take a different interest, and banks that once winked at appearances start to look at ledgers. In the weeks that followed, public records reflected the reality we'd projected that night. Mortgages were called in sooner than expected. A trust that had seemed broad and stable found its lines thinning in ways people with fewer appearances remarked upon quietly in the city. Within months, the family trust liquidated one of the properties. Call it a consequence, call it natural consequence. The public files tell their own story, and I don't have to embellish it for taste. The morning after the wedding's public unraveling, someone left a bouquet for the kitchen staff with a note, "For the people who make everything real." Phipe pinned it to the bulletin board, the paper a small flag of gratitude. Staff lore adopted the night like a new scar healed into a lesson. The hotel had the capacity to expose truth, but more importantly, it also had the capacity to shelter and repair. Madison and Brett did not vanish into the kind of quiet shame that erases a person. They did the harder work of repair. Brett showed up at our operations office a week later in jeans and a willingness to scrub floors and shadow managers, and, when asked, to take responsibility for mistakes. He learned the numbers that govern hospitality, the little arithmetic of deposits and refunds and vendor margins. He came to understand that goodwill without balance is not generosity, it's a liability. Madison, for her part, entered the apprenticeship I'd offered. She started in the simplest places: inventory, vendor vetting, the small art of confirming a deposit. Humility has a curriculum. It's mostly made of minutes and receipts and the satisfaction of a job done well. She learned to make callus-friendly seating plans and how to read a contract without flinching. People who know her now say she's quieter, less performative, but more present. That change was not theatrical. It was practical, and it steadied more than one relationship in her life. We held a small, late summer ceremony for them a year later in one of the chain's smaller event rooms. It was a quiet thing, no platitudes about who was invited, no competitive posturing. Staff were there, true witnesses, Phipe and David, and a clutch of servers who had worked on that particular night and had seen what truth could do when wielded without malice. The ceremony was simple, with food cooked by the same kitchen that had once been the backdrop to a different kind of theater. There were smiles, real this time, and a soft laughter that had lost its bite. As for the Ashfords, they receded into public record and private consequence. A foreclosure pruned a limb from their tableau. The house went to a sale that was reported in a small paragraph in a neighborhood newsletter. People who attend charity luncheons adjust the legroom they give to those whose fortunes change. The world moves on, as it always does, with new families taking the center table and others folding into the background. I felt neither triumphant nor vindictive at their losses.
I felt the sober satisfaction of someone who has paid their duty as a steward. The staff, who had been my quiet allies all along, received more than apologies. We set up a small fund for event staff emergency support, because the difference between a temporary loss and a catastrophic fall is often a matter of sense and sentiment. We formalized the vendor review process. We adjusted the deposit terms for large events to prevent similar entanglements. Those are boring sentences, but they matter. Justice in hospitality sometimes reads like paperwork. It's unglamorous and it's quietly preventative. People ask me sometimes what it feels like to be unknown and then known, to stand at a service entrance and be dismissed, and then to walk into a room under the spotlight of truth. It's equal parts exhaustion and clarity. I have learned that being the person who sees the gears means you often must choose when to oil them and when to expose them.
That night, I chose exposure with a purpose, to protect people who earned a living by making others' moments happen, and to give my sister a chance to step into adulthood that wasn't propped by borrowed funds and borrowed dignity. There were awkward conversations after. Family dinners reconstituted themselves in different shapes. Some people in the Ashford circle made apologies that read like contracts. Others made gestures that felt performative. Time sorted them. I won't pretend I have a saint's patience for everyone. I do have, however, a capacity for practical mercy. Months later, I found myself walking into a refurbished conference room and signing the acquisition papers for our 18th property. The work of building a company teaches you that growth is less about conquest and more about stewardship. I still prefer the service door for the view. There's a clarity to seeing your business from where the dishes clatter and the staff trade jokes. Power is humbling when you understand how many hands keep the house standing. The story some people like to tell about that night is the part on the screen. An owner in an apron, a family unraveling, a projector's light. That's the scene that makes for social fodder. The quieter, less photogenic part is what happened after. The burned checks reconciled, the vendor invoices honored, the staff bonuses that were dropped into envelopes labeled for nights like this. That to me is the real arc of the tale. It's the part where justice meets repair, and where family, however messy, gets an honest chance to be better. I get messages sometimes from viewers, strangers who saw a clip and wanted to tell me that they admired my restraint, or that they'd never expected a hotel owner to masquerade as a server. People are fascinated by the inversion of assumption that the person you pass in slippers at the service store might be the one who signs the checks. It's a reminder that the world loves a neat twist. What I hope they take away, though, isn't the twist. It's the lesson. Power used to protect, not to punish, keeps things standing. Madison returned to our lives as someone who had learned the value of bills and bank stamps and the dignity of labor. Brett grew into a man who prefers spreadsheets to social climbing, and that steadied him. Chase, for all his charm, receded into a social orbit that had less oxygen. It's a mercy to some of us. The Ashfords learned, later than most would prefer, that you can't always borrow your reflection. And the hotel? It kept operating, because hospitality is the business of continuity. Guests still come for celebrations. Staff still set tables with an almost liturgical care. Phipe still grumbles about portion sizes, but now he tells a story sometimes about a night when the past lit up with truth, and how the kitchen fed not just bodies, but a lesson in dignity. They call that night in staff meetings as a shorthand, the projector night. It's a line in the ledger and a scar in the memory, both useful. When people ask if I regret the way I revealed things, I tell them no, not because I don't feel for the people whose reputation's frayed, but because truth, when it is handled responsibly, heals more than it harms. I had the option to watch and wait and let rumor proliferate and eventually cost people their livelihoods in ways that are crueler than exposure. Or I could present the facts, give those affected a path to repair, and make sure the staff, those whose hands had carried the evening, were never the ones to foot the bill for someone else's vanity. In the end, the best revenge is a table set with dignity. The night that began with a guard assuming my place at the door ended with people learning the cost of their assumptions. I never wanted the humiliation I endured to be the point. The point was to reveal a truth that would lead to accountability and to a better distribution of responsibility. If you like stories that balance justice with compassion, that prefer paperwork and kindness over spectacle, subscribe and share this one with someone who loves to see entitlement meet consequence. And if you ever walk into a hotel and find yourself at the service door, consider peeking into the kitchen. You'll learn more about life than you ever will from the cocktail napkins at the bar.